They came in waves. We fired until the barrels glowed red. Sergeant Mike O'Brien crouched behind his Browning M1919A4 machine gun, watching the Japanese soldiers emerge from the smoke and rubble of what had once been Sugar Loaf Hill. The date was May 21st, 1945, and the 6th Marine Division had been trying to take this godforsaken piece of coral and limestone for 18 days. Now, in what intelligence believed was their final desperate counterattack, the Japanese were throwing everything they had left at the American positions. "Sarge, there's hundreds of them." Private Danny Kowalski, his assistant gunner, fed another belt of 30-6 ammunition into the smoking weapon. The 19-year-old kid from Detroit had been shaking for 3 days straight, ever since they'd first set foot on this blood-soaked hill that the Japanese defended with suicidal determination. O'Brien squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of bullets into the advancing Japanese infantry. The machine gun bucked against his shoulder as the belt of ammunition disappeared into the weapon's hungry mechanism. 50 yards down the slope, Japanese soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe, but more kept coming. They emerged from caves, from spider holes, from positions that American artillery had been pounding for weeks. The Battle of Okinawa had been raging for nearly 2 months, and Sugar Loaf Hill had become a symbol of Japanese resistance. The coral limestone formation rose only 300 feet above the surrounding terrain, but it commanded the approaches to Naha, the island's capital. More importantly, it was part of a defensive system that the Japanese called the Shuri Line, a network of interconnected caves, tunnels, and fortified positions that had cost thousands of American lives. "Kowalski, get me another belt," O'Brien shouted over the din of combat. Artillery shells were falling all around them, some from Japanese guns hidden in the hills to the south, others from American batteries trying to break up the enemy attack. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of cordite, and the ground shook continuously from explosions. Behind them, Lieutenant Morrison was coordinating the defense with the other squad leaders. The young officer had been with the company for only 3 weeks. His predecessor had been killed by a Japanese sniper while trying to spot enemy positions. Morrison was a good officer, but he was learning that Okinawa was unlike any other battlefield in the Pacific War. The Japanese had abandoned their traditional Banzai charge tactics in favor of a defense in depth that maximized American casualties. Every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Every ridge had to be taken yard by yard. And every time the Americans thought they had secured a position, the Japanese would emerge from hidden tunnels and fight for it all over again. O'Brien's machine gun fell silent as the barrel began to glow cherry red from continuous firing. He grabbed the spare barrel that Kowalski had prepared and began the process of changing it out. The Japanese soldiers were less than 30 yards away now, close enough that he could see their faces, young men, most of them, probably drafted from rice farms and fishing villages, now charging toward certain death with rifles and grenades. The spare barrel was almost too hot to handle, even with asbestos gloves. O'Brien slammed it into place and racked the bolt just as the first Japanese soldier reached the American perimeter. The man was carrying a rifle with a fixed bayonet, screaming something in Japanese that O'Brien couldn't understand but didn't need to. The universal language of combat was clear enough. O'Brien's burst caught the soldier in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the mud that had been churned by thousands of boots and mixed with blood until it resembled some hellish soup. But behind him came another soldier, and another, and another. The Japanese were throwing themselves at the American positions with a ferocity that defied comprehension. "They're not stopping," Kowalski screamed, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. The young private had been feeding ammunition into the machine gun for 6 hours straight, and his hands were bleeding from handling the hot metal links. Why won't they stop? O'Brien didn't have an answer. He had fought in the Marshall Islands, at Saipan, and at Iwo Jima, but nothing had prepared him for Okinawa. The Japanese defenders weren't just fighting to hold territory. They were fighting to die with honor, to take as many Americans with them as possible, to delay the inevitable invasion of Japan itself. The machine gun chattered again, spitting death into the ranks of advancing Japanese soldiers. O'Brien traversed the weapon left and right, cutting down entire squads as they tried to rush the American positions. The belt of ammunition disappeared in seconds, and Kowalski was already feeding in another one. To their right, Corporal Martinez was firing his bar in short, controlled bursts, picking off Japanese soldiers who had taken cover behind the rubble of destroyed buildings. Martinez was a veteran of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, and he had the calm precision that came from 2 years of jungle fighting. But even he looked shaken by the intensity of the Japanese assault. "Sarge!" Private Johnson called out from the foxhole to O'Brien's left. "They're coming up through the drainage ditch." "Must be 20 of them." O'Brien swung the machine gun around and opened fire on the new threat. The Japanese soldiers were using a concrete drainage ditch to approach the American positions under cover, but their machine guns' plunging fire caught them in the open. The 30-6 bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls, filling the ditch with deadly fragments of lead and stone. The attack began to falter as Japanese casualties mounted. O'Brien estimated that they had killed over 100 enemy soldiers in the past hour, but he knew that more were waiting in the caves and tunnels that honeycombed Sugar Loaf Hill. This was just the first wave of what promised to be a long night. Lieutenant Morrison crawled over to O'Brien's position, staying low to avoid the sniper fire that was coming from the hills to the south. The young officer's uniform was torn and stained with mud and blood, and his face showed the strain of commanding men in impossible circumstances. "How much ammunition do you have left?" Morrison asked. O'Brien checked his remaining belts. "Maybe 2,000 rounds, sir." "Kowalski's been conserving as much as he can, but they keep coming." Morrison nodded grimly. "Supply says they'll try to get more ammo up here after dark, but the Japanese have been hitting our supply lines hard. We need to make every shot count." Part 3. The cost of ground. As the sun began to set over Okinawa, the Japanese attacks intensified. O'Brien could see enemy soldiers moving through the ruins of what had once been a small village at the base of Sugar Loaf Hill. They were using the cover of darkness to mass for another assault, and he knew that the worst was yet to come. The machine gun had been firing almost continuously for 8 hours, and despite the barrel changes, the weapon was showing signs of wear. The timing was slightly off, causing occasional jams that Kowalski had to clear while bullets flew overhead. Each malfunction lasted only seconds, but in combat, seconds could mean the difference between life and death. "Sarge, I'm seeing movement in that cave entrance at 2 o'clock, Kowalski reported, peering through the gathering dusk. The private had developed an uncanny ability to spot Japanese positions, probably because his life depended on it. O'Brien followed Kowalski's gaze and saw them, dark figures moving in the shadows of a cave mouth that American engineers had supposedly sealed with demolition charges 3 days earlier. The Japanese had either cleared the entrance or found another way out of their underground fortress. "Light 'em up," O'Brien ordered, and Kowalski triggered a white phosphorus flare that arced over the battlefield and burst into brilliant white light. The illumination revealed at least 50 Japanese soldiers preparing for another assault, their uniforms and equipment showing the wear of months of underground fighting. O'Brien opened fire immediately, his tracers arcing across the battlefield like deadly fireflies. The machine gun's bullets sparked off the coral limestone, and he could see Japanese soldiers falling as the burst found its mark. But the others kept moving, using the terrain to their advantage as they worked their way closer to the American positions. The battle had become a nightmare of continuous violence. American artillery was falling on the Japanese positions, but the enemy had learned to shelter in deep caves that could withstand everything except direct hits. Japanese mortars were answering with their own barrage, walking their fire across the American lines with deadly precision. Corporal Williams, commanding the squad to O'Brien's left, was hit by a mortar fragment that opened a gash across his forehead. The corporal wrapped a bandage around his head and kept fighting, but O'Brien could see that the man was struggling to stay conscious. They were all exhausted, running on adrenaline, and the knowledge that stopping meant dying. "Incoming!" Someone shouted, and O'Brien dove for cover as a Japanese artillery shell exploded 20 yards away. The blast showered his position with coral fragments and sent a cloud of choking dust across the battlefield. When he raised his head, he saw that the explosion had opened a crater big enough to hide a jeep. Kowalski was bleeding from a dozen small cuts where coral fragments had hit him, but he was still conscious and still feeding ammunition into the machine gun. The kid had turned out to be tougher than anyone had expected, including himself. "They're massing again," Lieutenant Morrison called out. "Looks like they're going to hit us from 3 directions this time." O'Brien checked his ammunition supply and grimaced. They were down to their last 1,000 rounds, and resupply wouldn't come until after midnight, if it came at all. The Japanese had been interdicting American supply lines with increasing effectiveness, using their knowledge of the terrain to ambush convoys and supply parties. The second major assault began at 2,100 hours, just as the moon was rising over the Pacific. This time, the Japanese came from 3 directions simultaneously, emerging from caves and tunnels that the Americans didn't even know existed. O'Brien estimated that there were at least 300 enemy soldiers in the attack, more than his entire company had faced in any single engagement. The machine gun opened up immediately, spraying 30-6 bullets into the advancing masses of Japanese infantry. O'Brien traversed the weapon back and forth, trying to cover the maximum area with his fire. The barrel was glowing red again, and he could smell the metal heating up, but there was no time to change it. To his right, Martinez was firing his bar as fast as he could pull the trigger, the 30-6 rounds cutting down Japanese soldiers who had made it within 50 yards of the American positions. But there were too many of them, and some were getting through the defensive fire. "Grenades!" Kowalski shouted, pointing to a group of Japanese soldiers who had taken cover behind a wrecked American jeep. O'Brien could see them preparing to throw their grenades, the distinctive stick-type explosives that the Japanese favored for close combat. He swung the machine gun around and fired a long burst that turned the jeep into a sieve of bullet holes. The Japanese soldiers fell behind their improvised cover, but more were already taking their place. The attack was like a flood. Every gap in the American fire was immediately filled by more enemy soldiers. Private Johnson, fighting from the foxhole to O'Brien's left, stood up to throw a grenade and was immediately cut down by Japanese rifle fire. The young soldier from Kansas had been with the company for 4 months, and O'Brien had been training him as a potential squad leader. Now he was just another casualty in a battle that seemed to have no end. Johnson's hit, Corporal Martinez called out, but there was nothing anyone could do. The medics were pinned down by enemy fire, and anyone who tried to reach the wounded soldier would be killed before they could help him. O'Brien's machine gun jammed just as a group of Japanese soldiers broke through the perimeter on the left flank. Kowalski worked frantically to clear the stoppage while O'Brien drew his .45 pistol and began firing at the approaching enemy soldiers. The heavy slugs dropped 2 Japanese soldiers at close range, but the others kept coming. Lieutenant Morrison appeared with a Thompson submachine gun, spraying .45 ACP bullets into the breakthrough. The young officer was bleeding from a head wound, but he fought with the desperate courage of a man who knew that retreat meant death for his entire unit. The machine gun came back to life just as the Japanese soldiers reached the American foxholes. O'Brien swung the weapon around and fired point-blank into the enemy infantry, the muzzle blast singeing the uniform off a Japanese soldier who was less than 10 feet away. The man fell backward, his rifle clattering on the coral limestone. But the assault wasn't over. More Japanese soldiers were emerging from the caves, and O'Brien could see that this was going to be a fight to the finish. The enemy had committed everything they had left to this attack, and they were going to keep coming until every last man was dead. By midnight, the machine gun had fired over 8,000 rounds, and O'Brien was down to his last belt of ammunition. The weapon was so hot that it was cooking off rounds without him pulling the trigger, and the barrel was beginning to warp from the heat. Kowalski had been wounded twice, once by a grenade fragment and once by a ricochet, but he was still feeding ammunition and calling out targets. The Japanese attacks had become increasingly desperate as their casualties mounted. O'Brien estimated that they had killed over 400 enemy soldiers in the past 3 hours, but the survivors were still fighting with fanatic determination. Some of them were carrying only knives or sharpened bamboo spears, having run out of ammunition hours earlier. "Sarge, I can see the bottom of the ammo can," Kowalski reported, his voice hoarse from shouting over the gunfire. The private's hands were shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, but he was still doing his job. O'Brien nodded grimly. When the ammunition ran out, they would have to fight with rifles and pistols, and that would be the beginning of the end. The Japanese had superior numbers, and in close combat, their advantage would be decisive. Lieutenant Morrison crawled over to their position, staying low as Japanese bullets whined overhead. The officer was barely conscious from blood loss, but he was still trying to coordinate the defense. "How are you holding up?" Morrison asked. "We're almost out of ammo, sir," O'Brien replied. "Maybe 200 rounds left." Morrison nodded. "I've called for artillery support, but they're worried about hitting our own positions. The Japanese are too close." As if to emphasize the point, a Japanese soldier suddenly appeared at the edge of their foxhole, having crawled through the dead ground between the positions. O'Brien shot him with his pistol before the man could throw his grenade, but the explosion of the dropped grenade wounded Kowalski in the leg. "I'm okay, Sarge," Kowalski insisted, but O'Brien could see that the kid was barely staying conscious. Blood was seeping through the bandage on his leg, and his face was pale from shock and blood loss. The machine gun fired its last belt of ammunition just as another wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the caves. O'Brien watched the tracers arc across the battlefield and disappear into the darkness, knowing that when they stopped, his primary weapon would be useless. But something had changed in the Japanese attack. The soldiers were moving more slowly, and their coordination was breaking down. Many of them were wounded, and some were staggering with exhaustion. The continuous assaults had taken a terrible toll on the defenders as well as the attackers. Corporal Martinez, still fighting with his bar from the position to the right, called out over the din of combat. "Sarge, I think they're running out of steam." The last bunch barely made it halfway up the hill. O'Brien looked across the battlefield and realized that Martinez was right. The Japanese had been attacking for over 5 hours, and their casualties were catastrophic. The coral limestone slopes of Sugar Loaf Hill were carpeted with bodies, and the survivors were showing signs of exhaustion and demoralization. Dawn was breaking over Okinawa when the Japanese launched what would be their final assault on Sugar Loaf Hill. O'Brien counted fewer than 50 enemy soldiers in the attack, all that remained of the force that had numbered over 800 men 12 hours earlier. These survivors were the toughest and most experienced of the Japanese defenders, and they fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were going to die. Without ammunition for the machine gun, O'Brien had taken up his M1 Garand rifle and was firing carefully aimed shots at the approaching Japanese soldiers. Each 30-6 bullet had to count because resupply was still hours away. Kowalski, despite his wounds, was serving as a spotter and calling out targets. "Sniper in the cave mouth at 11 o'clock, Kowalski reported, his voice weak but steady. The private was losing blood, but he refused to be evacuated while the battle was still raging. O'Brien lined up his shot and squeezed the trigger. The Japanese sniper tumbled out of his hiding place and fell to the coral below. It was O'Brien's 15th confirmed kill of the battle, but he had stopped counting hours ago. The only thing that mattered was stopping the enemy attack. Lieutenant Morrison, now barely conscious from his head wound, was still trying to coordinate the defense with hand signals and whispered commands. The young officer had proven himself under fire, and O'Brien knew that without Morrison's leadership, the position would have been overrun hours earlier. The Japanese SLGers were using their dead comrades as cover, crawling through the piles of bodies that littered the battlefield. It was a grisly tactic, but effective. The American rifles had trouble distinguishing between the living and the dead in the chaos of combat. One Japanese soldier made it to within 10 yards of O'Brien's position before Martinez cut him down with a burst from his bar. The man had been carrying a satchel charge, enough explosive to destroy the entire squad. The blast would have killed everyone in the immediate area and opened a gap in the American line. "That was too close," Martinez called out, ejecting the empty magazine from his automatic rifle. "I'm down to my last roll clips." All along the American line, the situation was the same. The defenders were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and men. 3 squad leaders had been killed, and half the riflemen were wounded. But they were still holding their positions, still fighting with the determination that had carried them across the Pacific. The Japanese attack faltered as the last of their assault troops fell to American fire. O'Brien could see a few survivors retreating toward the caves, but they were no longer an organized fighting force. The final desperate assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had failed, costing the Japanese over 600 casualties in a single night. As the sun rose higher, O'Brien surveyed the battlefield. The coral limestone slopes were covered with Japanese dead, their uniforms and equipment scattered across the torn ground. Some of the bodies were piled 3 deep where the machine gun had caught them in the open. It was a scene of carnage that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The resupply convoy arrived at 0800, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements to the battered defenders of Sugar Loaf Hill. O'Brien watched as medics worked to stabilize the wounded, including Kowalski, who was finally allowing himself to be evacuated to the aid station. "You did good, kid," O'Brien told his assistant gunner as they loaded him onto a stretcher. "You saved a lot of lives last night." Kowalski managed a weak smile. "Just doing my job, Sarge." "Take care of the gun." As the stretcher bearers carried Kowalski away, O'Brien turned his attention to the machine gun that had been his primary weapon for the past 12 hours. The barrel was completely ruined, warped from the heat of continuous firing. The receiver was cracked in 2 places, and the trigger mechanism was worn beyond repair. The weapon had fired over 10,000 rounds during the battle and would need to be completely rebuilt. Lieutenant Morrison, now conscious but still weak from blood loss, approached O'Brien's position. The young officer was wearing a fresh bandage around his head, and his arm was in a sling, but he was still on duty. "The colonel wants a full report on last night's action," Morrison said. "Preliminary casualty reports indicate that we killed over 600 Japanese soldiers, maybe more. It was one of the largest Banzai attacks of the entire Okinawa campaign." O'Brien nodded, but he took no satisfaction in the numbers. Each enemy casualty represented a young man who would never go home, never see his family again. The Japanese soldiers had fought with courage and determination, even in the face of hopeless odds. "What's the word on our casualties, sir?" O'Brien asked. Morrison's expression grew somber. 12 Kia, 37 wounded. Johnson didn't make it. He died during the night. Williams and Rodriguez are being evacuated to the hospital ship. The numbers were typical for the Battle of Okinawa, where every yard of ground cost both sides dearly. The Japanese were defending their homeland's doorstep, while the Americans were trying to secure a base for the invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood that this was a fight to the finish. Over the next several hours, burial details worked to clear the battlefield of Japanese dead. The bodies were buried in mass graves, with simple wooden markers noting the date and location. American casualties were treated with more ceremony, but the end result was the same: young men who would never see home again. Intelligence officers interviewed the survivors, trying to piece together the Japanese tactics and determine whether similar attacks might be expected elsewhere on the island. The interrogations revealed that the assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had been a desperate gamble, ordered by Japanese commanders who knew that their position was hopeless. 3 days later, Sugar Loaf Hill was finally secured after American engineers blasted the remaining cave entrances with demolition charges. The hill that had cost hundreds of American casualties and thousands of Japanese lives was just another piece of coral limestone, valuable only for its commanding view of the approaches to Naha. O'Brien was reassigned to a new machine gun team with a fresh weapon and a replacement assistant gunner, Private Anderson, who had just arrived from the States. The kid was eager and well-trained, but he had never been in combat before. O'Brien found himself thinking about Kowalski, wondering if the wounded private would recover enough to return to duty. The Battle of Okinawa continued for another month, with American forces grinding their way south against fanatical Japanese resistance. Every ridge, every village, every cave had to be taken by force, and the casualties mounted on both sides. By the time the island was finally secured, over 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese had died in the fighting. The statistics were numbing, but O'Brien understood their significance. The Japanese had shown that they would fight to the death rather than surrender, and that an invasion of Japan itself would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The desperate assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had been a preview of what awaited Allied forces on the beaches off Honshu and Kyushu. But the Japanese losses were equally significant. The soldiers who had died on Sugar Loaf Hill were irreplaceable, experienced infantry who had been fighting since the beginning of the war. Their deaths, multiplied across dozens of similar battles throughout Okinawa, had gutted the Japanese army's ability to defend the home islands. Lieutenant Morrison, now recovered from his wounds, found O'Brien cleaning his new machine gun on the reverse slope of Sugar Loaf Hill. The young officer looked older than his 23 years, aged by the responsibility of commanding men in impossible circumstances. "The word is that we're going to be part of the invasion of Japan," Morrison said, settling down beside O'Brien. "Operation Downfall. They're expecting it to be 10 times worse than Okinawa." O'Brien nodded grimly. He had read the intelligence reports about Japanese preparations for the defense of their homeland. Millions of civilians were being trained to fight with bamboo spears and improvised weapons. Every beach, every airfield, every city would be defended with the same fanatic determination that they had seen on Okinawa. "Maybe the brass will come up with something else," O'Brien replied. "Some way to end this without invading Japan." Neither man mentioned the rumors that had been circulating about a new type of bomb, something so powerful that it could destroy an entire city. Such weapons seemed like science fiction, but after 3 years of Pacific fighting, both men had learned that the impossible often became reality in wartime. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded O'Brien of the muzzle flashes he had seen during the night battle. In the distance, he could see the lights of American ships anchored off the Okinawan coast, preparing supplies for the next phase of the war. 2 weeks after the fall of Sugar Loaf Hill, O'Brien received word that Private Kowalski had died of his wounds at the hospital ship. The news hit him harder than he had expected. The kid from Detroit had become like a younger brother during their months of fighting together. Another casualty of a war that seemed to have no end. The replacement assistant gunner, Private Anderson, was competent but inexperienced. He had been trained on the machine gun at Camp Pendleton, but training could never prepare a man for the reality of combat. O'Brien found himself thinking about all the young soldiers he had trained and fought alongside, and how few of them had survived to see the end of the war. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were preparing massive defensive positions throughout the home islands, using the lessons they had learned from Okinawa. Millions of soldiers and civilians were being mobilized for a final defense that would make the assault on Sugar Loaf Hill look like a skirmish. But there were also signs that the Japanese war effort was collapsing from within. American submarines had sunk most of the Japanese merchant fleet, cutting off supplies of oil, food, and raw materials. B-29 bombers were burning Japanese cities one by one, and the civilian population was suffering from starvation and disease. The assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had been part of a larger pattern of Japanese defensive tactics that emphasized inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. But these tactics came at a terrible cost. The Japanese army was bleeding experienced soldiers faster than they could be replaced, and their equipment was becoming increasingly obsolete. O'Brien's new machine gun team was assigned to the 1st Marine Division, which was being reorganized and re-equipped for the invasion of Japan. The Marines who had survived Okinawa were being promoted to fill the gaps left by casualties, and new recruits were arriving from the States to bring the division up to strength. The training for Operation Downfall was intense and realistic, based on the hard-won lessons of the Okinawa campaign. American planners expected Japanese resistance to be even more determined on their home soil, and casualty estimates were staggering: over 500,000 American dead and wounded in the first 6 months of fighting. But the invasion of Japan would never come. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, destroying the city in a flash of nuclear fire. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, ending the Pacific War without the massive bloodshed that everyone had expected. When news of Japan's surrender reached Okinawa, O'Brien's first thought was of all the men who hadn't lived to see this day. Kowalski, Johnson, Williams, Rodriguez, and hundreds of others who had died fighting for coral ridges and limestone hills that were strategically important but ultimately meaningless. The war was over, but the cost had been enormous. The machine gun that had served O'Brien so well during the Battle of Sugar Loaf Hill was retired to a depot on Guam, where it would be rebuilt and stored against future conflicts. O'Brien himself was assigned to occupation duties in Japan, where he would spend the next 6 months helping to disarm the Japanese military and establish Allied control. The Japan he found was a devastated country, its cities burned, its people starving, its military completely defeated. The soldiers who had fought so fanatically on Okinawa were now prisoners of war, working to rebuild the country they had tried to defend. The contrast was stark and sobering. In Tokyo, O'Brien met some of the Japanese officers who had commanded the defense of Okinawa. They were professional soldiers, much like himself, who had been fighting for their country and their emperor. In other circumstances, he might have respected them as fellow warriors. But the memory of Sugar Loaf Hill and of all the men who had died there made such respect impossible. The final casualty figures for the Battle of Okinawa were staggering: 12,300 American dead, 38,000 wounded, and over 100,000 Japanese military deaths. Civilian casualties were estimated at 150,000, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. The assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had been just one small part of this larger carnage, but for O'Brien, it represented the essence of the entire campaign. In December 1945, O'Brien boarded a transport ship for the voyage home to the United States. As the ship pulled away from the Japanese coast, he stood at the rail and looked back at the islands where he had spent 2 years of his life. The war was over, but its memories would stay with him forever. The machine gun team that had defended Sugar Loaf Hill had been dissolved, its members scattered to the four winds. Some, like Kowalski, were dead. Others, like Anderson, were staying in the Marines to make it a career. O'Brien himself was going home to Ohio, where he planned to use the GI Bill to go to college and start a new life. But he would never forget the night when the Japanese came in waves, and he fired until the barrel glowed red. The Battle of Okinawa had been a preview of what the invasion of Japan would have cost, and the desperate assault on Sugar Loaf Hill had shown both sides the true price of victory. Over 10,000 Japanese soldiers had died in their final desperate attacks across the island, and their sacrifice had helped convince American leaders that there had to be another way to end the war. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki were terrible weapons, but they had saved millions of lives on both sides by making the invasion of Japan unnecessary. The machine gunners who had held Sugar Loaf Hill would not have to storm the beaches of Honshu, and the Japanese soldiers who would have defended those beaches would not have to die in hopeless Banzai charges. As the transport ship disappeared over the horizon, O'Brien reflected on the cost of the war he was leaving behind. The Battle of Okinawa had been the last major campaign of World War II, and the desperate Japanese assaults on places like Sugar Loaf Hill had demonstrated both the futility and the nobility of fighting for a lost cause. The war was over, but its lessons would echo through history, a reminder of the price that young men pay for the decisions of their leaders.